You're walking down the street. Nice shoes, cushioned soles, not a care in the world. And then it happens. A tiny pebble, barely bigger than a grain of rice, slips inside your shoe and lodges itself against your heel. Your entire day stops. You're hopping to the curb, untying laces, shaking your shoe upside down like it personally betrayed you, all because of something the size of a lentil. Now here's the question that should actually bother you. Your ancestors did this same walk, except they did it for thousands of miles, across volcanic rock, burning desert sand, and thorn-covered scrubland, with absolutely nothing between their skin and the ground. No socks, no soles, nothing. So what happened to us? Were their feet built differently? Or did we just forget one of the most quietly incredible pieces of engineering the human body has ever produced? Let's go back. Roughly 70,000 years ago, small groups of early humans began leaving East Africa. No maps, no water bottles, no shoes. And yet, within tens of thousands of years, their descendants had crossed the Himalayas, pushed through Siberian ice fields, and eventually made their way into the Americas by at least 15,000 years ago. That's not one clean journey. It's a multi-generational relay of migration, adaptation, and, at the center of all of it, an enormous amount of walking. On bare feet. We think of the foot today as basically a shoe rack, something to stuff into sneakers and forget about until it hurts. But for most of human history, the foot wasn't just a way to get around. It was a sensor, a shock absorber, an energy recycling machine. Today we're looking at what the human foot actually is, why it was capable of things that sound almost impossible now, and why the very invention that made our lives more comfortable, the shoe, quietly disabled one of the most sophisticated pieces of biological engineering we ever evolved. Let's start with the architecture, because this is where it gets genuinely strange. Your foot is not some evolutionary afterthought. It's one of the most complex structures in your entire body. Each foot contains 26 bones. That means roughly a quarter of all the bones in your body are packed into the two things you probably think about the least. Add in 33 joints and well over 100 muscles, tendons, and ligaments, and you start to understand why the foot is less like a simple lever and more like a piece of precision machinery. Here's the problem it had to solve. The foot needs to do two completely contradictory things, and it needs to do them within the same second. When it hits the ground, it has to be soft, absorbing the shock like a cushion. And then, almost instantly, it has to become rigid, like a solid lever, so it can push the body forward again. Soft, then hard. Over and over, thousands of times a day. The part that makes this possible is the arch of your foot, and this is genuinely one of the most elegant tricks in human biology. When a barefoot walker's foot strikes the ground, body weight flattens that arch slightly, and the tendons running underneath stretch like a rubber band being pulled taut. That stretch stores energy. Then, the instant the foot lifts off for the next step, that stored energy releases and snaps the body forward, with barely any extra muscular effort required. In other words, barefoot walking was a form of energy recycling. Every step partially paid for the next one. But here's the part that should genuinely unsettle you. Modern cushioned shoes with built-in arch support do the arch's job for it. And when something else does a muscle's job for it long enough, that muscle gets lazy. This is a big part of why walking barefoot today feels exhausting and painful almost immediately, not because your foot was never built for it, but because the machinery has been sitting unused for years, rusting in a shoe. There's another piece of this that almost never comes up, the Achilles tendon. Humans have a longer, thicker Achilles tendon relative to our body size than almost any other primate. And researchers who study human locomotion, including biologist Daniel Lieberman at Harvard, have pointed to that tendon as functioning almost like a spring-loaded catapult during sustained running. Every foot strike loads it, every push-off unloads it, and that stored elastic energy is a major reason humans could move long distances using remarkably little metabolic fuel. And then there are the toes. Unbound by shoes, ancient human toes splayed outward like a fan, instead of curling inward the way ours often do now. They gripped uneven ground almost independently, correcting balance in real time on slopes and loose terrain, the same way fingers adjust their grip on an object. We spend our lives walking on rigid platforms today. Our ancestors were, in a very real sense, walking on a second pair of hands. Let's be honest for a second, though, because if you kicked off your shoes right now and tried to walk down a gravel driveway, it would not feel like a spiritual awakening. It would feel like stepping on broken glass. So how did people manage this for entire lifetimes? The answer is something we've turned into a beauty problem: the callus. We treat calluses like a flaw, something to sand off, moisturize away, hide. But biologically, a callus is one of the more sophisticated pieces of adaptive tissue engineering the human body produces. When the skin on the sole is repeatedly exposed to friction and pressure, the body responds by accelerating the production of keratinocytes, skin cells that generate keratin, the same tough structural protein found in hair and nails. Over time, this builds a dense, resilient layer of protective tissue. Here's the part that surprises most people. Thick calluses do not numb the foot the way a shoe does. Studies on habitually barefoot populations have found that even with several millimeters of hardened skin, the nerve endings underneath remain remarkably sensitive. That meant an ancient walker could still feel the difference between damp soil and dry ground, register faint vibrations that might signal an approaching animal, and adjust their balance on a slick rock in a fraction of a second. A shoe, by comparison, functions almost like a sensory deprivation chamber. It protects you, but it also disconnects you. A callus did both jobs at once. It armored the foot and kept it listening to the ground. Picture someone crossing a stretch of dry, thorn-covered scrubland. Every step lands on something sharp. But the thorns can't break through to living tissue underneath because the pressure is being spread out across a tough, load-bearing surface, similar to the way a tire distributes force across a tread. Over years, this tissue could become durable enough to resist even small, glass-like shards of volcanic stone. In effect, people were walking around in a pair of shoes that grew directly out of their own bodies, shoes that never needed replacing, and that quietly repaired themselves overnight. So why did feet need to be this tough in the first place? Because for most of human history, before bows, before spears with real range, this is how people got dinner. It's called persistence hunting, and it might be one of the strangest, most quietly brutal hunting strategies in the animal kingdom, because it doesn't rely on speed or strength at all. It relies on refusing to stop. Picture the heat of the African plains, somewhere around 40 degrees Celsius. A wildebeest or an antelope is grazing nearby. It is, in every measurable way, faster than the human tracking it. In a straight sprint, it disappears in seconds. But it has a weakness humans don't share. Four-legged animals cool themselves mainly by panting, and panting requires a steady, rhythmic breathing pattern that gets disrupted the moment they're forced into a full sprint. They can run fast, or they can cool down, not both at once. Early humans, it seems, figured this out. Instead of trying to outrun the animal, they simply started walking, then jogging, at a slow, sustainable pace, hour after hour. This is exactly where bare feet mattered. While the animal was burning enormous energy in short, explosive bursts, the human's spring-loaded foot and Achilles system let them cover ground using a fraction of the energy per stride. Some hunter-gatherer groups have been documented traveling 20 to 30 kilometers in a single pursuit. Under a relentless sun, with sweat glands doing what panting couldn't, the animal eventually overheats and collapses from exhaustion. The human, moving slower but never stopping, simply arrives. This wasn't a fluke. It was a strategy built entirely around endurance rather than power, and researchers who study human evolution consider it one of the strongest explanations for why our bodies are shaped the way they are. Long legs, a narrow torso built for heat dissipation, and yes, feet engineered for thousands of repeated, efficient steps. Those same feet transformed the people who used them. Calf muscles built for absorbing repeated impact. ankles with a range of flexibility that let people move confidently along narrow mountain ledges, footing that would send most modern hikers straight to the emergency room. Walking, for early humans, wasn't a passive act. It was closer to a skill, refined over a lifetime, the same way a craftsperson refines a trade. Fossilized footprints from this era consistently show wide, splayed, powerfully developed toes, a sharp contrast to the narrow, compressed toe shape most modern shoe wearers develop over a lifetime. Now, picture standing at the edge of that African horizon 70,000 years ago, with no idea what lies beyond it, and starting to walk anyway. This wasn't a single heroic journey. It was migration in the truest sense, generation after generation pushing slightly further, adapting as they went. Walking barefoot, it turns out, does something else beyond building tough skin. It floods the brain with information. Every step delivers data on surface texture, temperature, incline, friction, even faint ground vibration. Some researchers describe this as a kind of full-body environmental awareness, walking with the landscape rather than simply across it. As populations pushed into Asia and Europe, the terrain changed dramatically, and so did the demands on the body. Rocky mountain passes and uneven alpine terrain forced a different landing pattern. Weight distributed more toward the midfoot to spread out pressure from sharp, unpredictable ground. This migration functioned almost like a multi-generational stress test. People whose bodies couldn't adapt were, quite simply, less likely to survive and pass those traits forward. In a very real sense, the people alive today descend from the ones whose bodies could handle the walk. But eventually, this journey ran into an opponent that no callus, no matter how thick, could beat. Cold. When human populations reached the frozen edges of Siberia and northern Europe, they encountered a threat biology hadn't prepared them for. In sub-zero temperatures, blood flow to the extremities naturally restricts to protect the body's core. That means bare feet, even heavily calloused ones, were suddenly vulnerable to frostbite. A callus can stop a thorn. It cannot stop ice crystals from forming inside living tissue. This is where humans made one of their most consequential inventions, not for comfort, but for survival. The earliest known footwear wasn't anything like a modern shoe. It was closer to an insulated foot pouch. Archaeologists working at a cave site in Armenia uncovered a remarkably well-preserved leather shoe dating back roughly 5,500 years. A single piece of cowhide laced around the foot and packed with dry grass for insulation. And the evidence goes back even further. Sagebrush bark sandals discovered in a cave in Oregon have been dated to over 10,000 years old, among the oldest footwear ever found. At first, these weren't about protecting the sole from the ground at all. They were about trapping a thin layer of warm air around the foot to prevent frostbite. But that survival solution came with an unintended cost. The moment the foot was permanently enclosed, direct contact between nerve endings and the ground was cut off. Calluses that had built up over generations began to fade. The small, stabilizing muscles that once fired constantly to balance on uneven terrain had far less work to do, and, like any underused muscle, began to weaken. With the invention of the shoe, humans had, in a sense, started redesigning their own bodies. Over thousands of years, that early insulated pouch evolved into increasingly rigid, structured footwear. Toes that once splayed outward to grip the earth were gradually pressed together inside narrow leather and eventually narrow synthetic shapes. This is arguably one of the most underrated turning points in human history, the moment engineering started to quietly replace biological adaptation. We no longer needed our feet to develop the same resilience, because we built an external layer that did the job instead. It was, without question, a survival win. But it came with a bill that wouldn't come due for thousands of years, one now showing up as chronic knee pain, back pain, and foot dysfunction across much of the modern world. We've become a species that walks on external scaffolding, while somewhere underneath all of it, the memory of that original biological machine is still fully intact. So here's where all of this actually lands. This isn't really a story about tough skin or unusually strong bones. It's a story about a species that had almost nothing but its own body, and somehow used that body to walk into every corner of the planet. The people who crossed the Himalayas and pushed through Siberian winters had no guarantee any of it would work. They had 2 feet and the ground moving beneath them, and that turned out to be enough. You're probably not going to run down a wildebeest for dinner this week, and you almost certainly don't need to wrap your feet in dried grass to survive the winter. But the engineering is still there, sitting quietly underneath you right now. 26 bones, a spring-loaded arch, an Achilles tendon built like a coiled catapult. All of it still fully operational, just waiting for a reason to be used. So the next time you get the chance, take your shoes off, walk across wet grass or warm sand, and let that old, dormant machinery wake up for a few minutes. Feel the ground the way it was meant to be felt. In that moment, you're not just going for a barefoot walk. You're reactivating a connection that's tens of thousands of years old, and putting your feet, quite literally, into the footprints of the people who walked so far that they populated the entire world. We have always been movers, and the real secret was never in a tool, or a shoe, or a piece of technology. It was in the simple, stubborn refusal to stop walking, one step at a time, until there was nowhere left on Earth to go.